When King John of England was born, he wasn't expected to inherit any land, and thus was called John Lackland, but John would become a historically significant king. His rule would lead to the signing of the Magna Carta, the loss of the Angevin Empire, and the rise of the legend of Robin Hood. John's rule was unpopular, had quite a bit of chaos towards the end, including an invasion by the French heir apparent, and into this time a hero rose in the deep forests of the Weald, wielding a bow and leading a band of not necessarily merry men in something out of a modern-day adventure movie. It is history that deserves to be remembered. John had inherited a large number of lands and titles when his brother, Richard the Lionheart, died in 1199. In addition to King of England, he also held territory in France, including Brittany, Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine, as well as some control over parts of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. However, the complexities of feudal rule, while King of England, the various duchies all owed vassalage to the King of France, and competing methods of succession led to the destruction of the empire. With the exception of Normandy, most of the French holdings chose Duke Arthur, Richard's nephew, as their heir to their titles, and not John. John fought to regain his lands until his allies were decisively defeated at the Battle of Bouvines, forcing him to sue for peace. John's loss weakened his position in England. Already he had engendered enmity through high taxes that he needed to support the fight on the continent, which had come to naught. In the years that followed, growing resentment, especially among barons in the north of England, began to grow serious. In 1212, there was a plot to overthrow John, which he was able to foil. But another campaign to retake his French holdings in 1214 seems to have been the last straw for many landowners. Led by Robert Fitzwalter, the landowners, usually called barons, gathered against John's excesses. The barons formed the Army of God, while John recruited mercenaries from the continent. John met the rebels near Windsor Castle in June 1215, which through mediation led to the creation of a charter, the so-called Magna Carta, to codify the agreement. Neither side seriously followed the agreement. John appealed to the Pope, who eventually excommunicated the barons, while the barons refused to give up London. War was inevitable. Looking for allies, the barons turned to the French Prince Louis, a grandson of Henry II. He was declared king and asked to invade to prevent the realm being pillaged by aliens. According to the Annals of Waverley, Louis invaded in May of 1216 and by July controlled around a third of the country, largely in the southeast of England in the region of Kent. More landowners defected from John, sensing the tide of the war. The Scot king went to Dover to give homage to Louis, and rebels lurked in Wales. Into this chaos rose a unique hero in the deep woods of Kent called the Weald. On May 26, 1216, John wrote to two bailiffs within the Weald, which lay between Dover and London. They were William of Cassingham and Richard Lucet of Sussex. They were ordered to meet with the Earl of Surrey for instructions. The exact instructions weren't written down, so the exact plans have been lost to history, but soon Cassingham and Lucet were gathering a local force of bowmen with the goal of disrupting the enemy's activities throughout the Weald. The Weald was heavily forested and in the 12th century still sparsely populated. Generally small settlements sat 4 or 5 miles apart within the woods, and the area remained notorious for harboring criminals. The hamlet of Cassingham, today known as Keynsham, is an extremely small settlement near the town of Rolvenden and about 15 miles north of Hastings. Cassingham himself is an obscure figure. In various sources he is called William of Collingham, William Vaux, Wilikin de Wand, de Was or de Was, and he earned a famous nickname, Wilikin of the Weald. Cassingham was the name of a manor near Rolvenden, and he became associated with the location, although it isn't clear if he was born there or came from elsewhere. The writer called Anonymous of Bethune, a city in Flanders, calls William a sergeant, which has led some to believe that he was a Flemish adventurer, many of whom had been brought to England as mercenaries to fight for King John. For unknown reasons, he settled in Keynsham. Details on his birth are even murkier. Historian G.R. Stevens suggests around 1195, as William was described as a young man in 1216, and chronicler Roger of Wendover says that William refused to give fealty to Louis. He seems to have been appointed a bailiff of the Rolvenden Hundred prior to Louis's invasion. Whatever his origins, William was loyal to King John and raised a significant force of yeoman archers in the Weald. According to Wendover, he recruited 1,000 archers, and that number may be an exaggeration, but William's men were extremely effective in the deep woods they called their home. Long before the term guerrilla warfare was coined, the men of the Weald were practicing it, in Kent. The French forces had to travel through the ancient tracks and paths of the Weald to reach London from French bases on the southern coast, where Louis could bring in supplies from his lands in France. William and his men made that journey difficult, assaulting supply caravans and striking French knights making their way through. The Weald became dangerous enough that some men simply refused to risk traveling in it. According to Wendover, William continued to trouble the French throughout the whole war and slew many thousands of them. One of the reasons he inspired such fear was because he refused to take prisoners, lacking any good way to imprison them, and with most of the royalist castles in the region either captured or besieged, anyone who surrendered was promptly beheaded. This especially frightened nobles, who expected to be captured and offered a chance for ransom. Of course, William and his men faced death too if they were captured as brigands in the woods. The contemporary writer of the History of William Marshall, a knight who fought for King John, says, "Witness the deeds of Wilikin of the Weald," giving credence to William's fame. In September of 1216, King John sent a letter to those who are sworn together of the counties of Kent, Sussex, and Surrey, and Southampton, thanking them for their fidelity and service. It doesn't address William by name, but as one of the most prominent figures of the resistance in the Weald, he was likely in John's thoughts. The end of the Barons' War was far from certain in the fall of 1216. John had begun a campaign to attempt to pry Louis out of the south of England without a decisive success. Tensions were rising in Louis's camp as well, as English nobles returned to King John in protest of the preferential treatment Louis gave French lords. Louis had failed to take Windsor or Dover castles, which had been besieged for months without success. On October 14th, Louis had given up the siege of Dover Castle and returned to London. Around the same time, King John contracted dysentery, which would ultimately kill him on October 19th. King John's death changed the course of the war. Without their hated enemy ruling the country, the barons had considerably less reason to fight. John's 9-year-old son was crowned Henry III under the protection of William Marshall, Earl of Pembroke. Cassingham remained loyal to the crown and swore fealty to the new child king. The Magna Carta, with some revisions, was reissued on November 12, 1216, and Marshall argued that the barons should hold the son in contempt for the sins of his father. Barons began shifting their allegiances to Henry, leaving Louis in a precarious position. But he still pressed his campaign, taking Hertford and Berkhamsted Castle in December of 1216. In the spring of 1217, Louis decided that he needed to return to France to gather reinforcements before he could continue his campaign. He negotiated truce and attempted to retake Rye before he left, but to do so he had to fight his way to the southern coast, where he could then sail to France, and that required him to traverse the Weald, where Wilikin and his archers were ready. Louis's men were ambushed at Lewes by William's archers, who successfully routed the French force. They also captured 2 nephews of the Count of Nevers. Louis's force found itself trapped, unable to return to London, as many of the bridges had been burned. What small force was sent to relieve them from London refused to cross the Weald, instead following the coast to Canterbury. As they retreated, William's archers cut off stragglers and hampered the French journey. The entire force found itself trapped at Winchelsea, with English ships blockading the coast while William's archers kept the French penned up and unable to even forage for food. The villagers in Winchelsea had burned their mills and fled, leaving little else to eat. One chronicler wrote that wheat they found there, but they knew not how to grind it. Long time were they in such a plight that they had to crush by hand the corn of which they made their bread. Louis only escaped when after weeks a French fleet was able to reach Winchelsea, freeing him to return to France. While he was gone, the English continued to challenge the French invaders. William Marshall chose Cassingham, along with Oliver, a bastard son of King John, to lead the attack on the French, who remained at Dover. They struck unexpectedly, burning the French huts and killing numerous guards. Louis returned with a paltry 120 knights from France in April of 1217, as his father was leery of helping him after the Pope excommunicated for his invasion. He planned to land at Dover, but the English attack forced him to land at Sandwich, which he burned in retaliation. Louis's invasion was falling apart. While he attempted to take Dover in another siege, he lost Lincoln in May, the decisive Second Battle of Lincoln. Marshall captured many of the barons loyal to Louis, weakening what support Louis had left. The final straw came in August, when reinforcements and supplies sailing from France were intercepted and defeated by the English fleet at the Battle of Sandwich. What allies were left to Louis pushed for a settlement, and the Treaty of Lambeth was signed on September 12th at the Kingston upon Thames. Louis gave up his claim to the English throne. Wilikin of the Weald, who had played no small part in the French defeat, was lauded and had received direct thanks from both King John and Henry. He was given a stipend from the crown, which he drew from for many years. Henry III thanked Cassingham specifically in the patent rolls, gave him tenements taken from rebels in Essex, and made him warden of the 700s of the Weald. Cassingham helped return lands taken by the rebels to royalists in the year after that war. Henry promised him money for the rest of his life and protection for his wife for 7 years after he died. In 1241, when Henry left the country, he wrote to his sheriffs in Cassingham to form parties to maintain the peace in his absence. Some historians have pointed to Wilikin of the Weald as a possible inspiration for the Robin Hood legend, although it's not really clear if his exploits impacted that legend in the coming centuries. Certainly there are similarities, him leading a band of archers in the deep woods, but Cassingham's band was never described as merry, and Robin Hood was generally seen as an opponent of King John rather than his servant. But even if he didn't inspire Robin Hood, he certainly earned a reputation of his own as a hero of England. Cassingham was certainly better off after the Barons' War due to the king's patronage, but he was probably never a wealthy man. He continued to serve the king in relatively lowly roles until 1251, passed away in 1257. Raphael Hollingshead, an English chronicler writing 3 centuries later, gave him an appropriate epithet: a worthy man of English blood. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.